on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
The exclusive, that ever-present tease that permeates every community you frequent. Maybe it's a store exclusive, which means you'll have to go through the hassle of importing. Maybe it's linked to a specific online store, which means you'd better get your pre-order in. Or maybe it's neither. Maybe it is sold at multiple stores, but in very limited numbers. So if you miss the boat, well, you're shit out of luck. Takara Legends falls into the final category, starting out in 2013 and continuing all the way up to 2019 by clawing out every exclusive it could through the Takara Tomy Mall. It was initiated to develop more anime-accurate renditions of Hasbro mainline figures. Of course, that doesn't include movie stuff, but you get the point. This was before the brand unification, so as far as I can gather, there wasn't much collaboration between Hasbro and Takara when it came to the paint scheme. In terms of the actual toy design, sure, Hasbro and Takara worked very closely, as they always have. But genuinely, Hasbro would take a more toy-accurate approach, except when they didn't, and Takara would go closer to the G1 cartoon, or one of the many anime that came after. Of course, your average Transformers collector, that didn't really matter. All they saw was the higher price tag and the better paint job most of the time, and they just said, I'm gonna get that instead. On top of this, much like Hasbro, Takara loved to play the retool game. And you know what's really popular in Japan for some reason? Animated. Through this mishmash of a line, grabbing everything under the Generations banner that it could, Takara decided to create what is essentially the only canonical toy of animated Slipstream. Yes, there have been others based on the same characters, but those often line up with different universes. This right here, for all intents and purposes, is animated Slipstream. Because as far as the Japanese continuity for Transformers goes, you can't have a tie-in manga or short story without universe jumping. It's just how it goes, I don't make the rules. And of course, given the low production numbers, not as low as some of the Fun Pub stuff that preceded it, just from being a collector's item and not a regular toy, prices these days are... Oh dear, Jesus. The question remains though, is she truly worth that price? Well, greetings Cybertronians and welcome back to another Second Opinion. I'm Dr. Lockdown and it's time to return and give another diagnosis to Takara Legends LG16 Slipstream. Now, to the uninformed, Slipstream might seem like a pretty lush figure. It takes a core character, retools it with new parts, gives it a premium paint job. What more could you ask for? Well, back in the day, a lot more actually. Right off the bat, this mold was hated to high heaven for a number of reasons. Granted, a lot of that was due to bias against the character, or rather the original character, Windblade. Starting off as a fan-voted creation where people would choose the personality, backstory, etc., Hasbro at the time saw the lucrative potential of her introduction. Of course they were going to capitalize on a brand new, aesthetically awesome, even if that wasn't an aspect that was voted on, character the fans held a certain connection to. And by capitalize I mean force her into every single piece of media they possibly could. Doesn't matter that her initial comics run was actually insanely well written, and yes, that's one of the few IDW 1.0 comics I've read. To the masses, she was essentially Blandy McBlandface that was taking screen time away from more established characters. Thank f*** we have the Cyberverse rendition these days to mitigate such complaints. Yes, the 2013-2014 era of the fandom was very much a different time, where vitriol was aimed in vastly different directions. Many of the complaints towards Slipstream were exacerbated thanks to the original Windblade version, and many of those were exacerbated due to the character, as opposed to actual complaints to the toy. People thought that this was the second coming of Geisha Satan, and right off the bat I can tell you this is not the case. Hating on the figure just because of 2 degrees of character separation is an incredibly imbecilic thing to do. Now, hating on the figure for its actual issues, that I can understand. Slipstream turns into a VTOL jet, and the Takara designers justified this Windblade mold artifact by claiming that these are what give Slipstream her interdimensional powers. I'm not making this up, it's a thing in the manga. The manga is weird as shit. Aesthetics-wise, I think I was far too harsh on the figure when I first reviewed it back in 2016. Rather than mellowing out over the time, I've just become mature enough to realize I was a idiot back then who had no idea what I was talking about. What I mean to say is that this is a ruddy, beautiful jet with wonderful plastic choices, beautiful paint that is applied to a ridiculously high amount, and a really good profile. Tackling the first 2 of these points, the plastic has a lovely metallic fleck to it, and it really helps bring it to life. Like, you put it next to either of the Windblades that preceded old Slipstream here, and there's just no contest. The purple surprisingly blends together quite well too. Upon closer inspection, sure, you can tell where some of it's molded and some of it's painted, but from a distance there really isn't that much difference. Even the grey plastic has a slight pearlescent quality to it, not to mention it's got a tinge of pearl colour itself. What do they call that colour anyway? I've got no idea. Point is, the colours on this thing look absolutely lush. I think the final push that ties this whole thing together is the transparent aqua on the cockpit and VTOL fans. Sadly, said VTOL fans are too tight to spin thoroughly, but they really help bring this design to life regardless. Also, in the original review, for some reason I took issue with these 2 red highlights on the top. Like, what the f***? Was I high or something? I don't know. It's a miracle I ever cured myself of that idiocy. Wait, on second thoughts, I'm still a dumbass. The profile is also pretty cohesive. Surprisingly, the legs blend in quite well on the top. As for the most part, this jet pushes a slightly futuristic feel. Apparently it's based on a real jet of some sort, but come on, in these colors all realism is thrown out the window. And yes, there is a ridiculous gap in the middle, one that would be filled in with the absurdly oversized sword on the original Windblade, but again, I don't think it ruins the overall aesthetic. From the right, or I suppose the wrong angles, it's a smidge of an eyesore, but even then, it's easily overlooked. One way in which this mold was described back in the day was polishing a turd, but as far as the vehicle mode is concerned, the base here is pretty solid. Aesthetically, we'll get to the build quality in a bit. My point is the design is pretty sweet, and the paint accents really help give her that premium feel. This is essentially the perfect jet mode to display on your bookcase. Doesn't even need anything else beside it. It's gorgeous enough that it can act as a centerpiece. Unfortunately, displaying it might be a bit difficult when the goddamn stand port is on the front. Now, stand compatibility isn't something I often go over, because it's assumed that everything post Thrilling 30 has stand compatibility, bar a few Studio Series examples and whatever the kiddie line has hooked up at the time. Aerial alternate modes thrive on this. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with Deluxe Spinester or Voyager Earthrise Starscream, it's a thing that has been pretty goddamn consistent. The reason I don't often mention it is because there's really no point. Then you get to Slipstream over here and it's placed all the way at the front, meaning the balance is way off. That in itself wouldn't be an issue if the whole thing wasn't coated in rubber, meaning it basically stretches itself out and falls off. Now fortunately you can get around this if you have a 5mm peg, although honestly you shouldn't need to go through this trouble on a figure like this. Still, solidity of stand ports isn't something that should be that high on the priority list when designing a figure, provided the engineering is solid. And, well, solidity is the main issue with this mode. This whole thing is basically held together with metaphorical duct tape. The wings very loosely peg onto the sides of the legs, and said legs very loosely peg together. Aesthetically, this jet mode is pretty solid, but it definitely isn't in the actual solidity department. The legs at the top don't even peg in place, they just sit there, letting gravity do the work for them. Back in the day, this jet mode was insanely loathed. Yes, not criticized, not hated, loathed. How dare they make such a wibbly jet mode? How dare they force this character down everyone's throats and then not deliver in the toy department? What lunatics! Here's the thing about this second opinion subline of reviews I've set up though. Hindsight is ripe for the taking. I cannot deny that this figure is sorely lacking in locking tabs, but I also can't deny that I've seen way worse. When you swoosh it around, nothing pops out. As long as you're delicate with it, everything will remain in place. It's not even that difficult to get everything into place, as long as you know what you're doing. It's not like Studio Series Roadbuster or World War II Bumblebee, where lightly tapping the sides causes every panel in a 5km radius to violently explode. Aside from the nose cone, which actually does have issues remaining tabbed in, pretty much everything else remains in place as long as you aren't slamming the damn thing into a wall. I genuinely think the Windblade character stigma blew this mode's issues out of proportion, and Slipstream still carried the baggage when she released. Of course, that didn't count for my own idiocy, that was just a lack of perspective on my part. If you're going to keep Windblade and by extension Slipstream in this mode, I can't really think of that many issues that'll dissuade you from enjoying it. The few flaws that are here can be easily overlooked. Well, aside from the fact that you can't see the null rays from the top, actually, come to think of it, that's kind of forcing you to overlook it. My point is that all these years later, I can see how amazing this jet mode really is. It's a testament to Archer-era design philosophy, as well as Sakara paint budgets at the time. In many ways, the brand unification has made toys better overall, but part of me will always miss releases like this. However, that's only the vehicle mode. This figure still carries a lot of baggage, and it's important to move forward and see if it's truly justified. So after a quick size rundown and a quick articulation list, so quick that it's basically just one point, it's time for the transformation, and at this point I don't have anything witty to say, so all I can say is, onward! Slipstream's transformation is interesting, at least it's more interesting than the other two Takara Legends Fembot retools. This kind of body type and this kind of character does lend itself to a jet mode. You can see evidence of such with Starscream and Soundwave from the Transformers Prime line. Slender robots do end up making good jets, but this was the first example of them trying such. Up until the creation of Windblade, and by extension Slipstream, there hadn't been any cases of this. So they were going in blind, and for a first attempt, it's really interesting. It's kind of similar to Power of the Primes Elite 1, where the legs make up the bulk of the fuselage, but ultimately you do get jet with a robot under it syndrome. It's just the way things are going to work out. First thing you want to do is make sure that the VTOLs are fully pegged into the wings. When they go flat, they actually lock in place, which is kind of nice. Also, funny thing, the prototype had all of these pearlescent silver parts painted in silver. Guess maybe due to budget reasons or paint chipping, they got rid of it. Well, it looks fine anyway. Fold up the landing gear like so. Unlock the nose cone from the bottom part there, although I say unlock very loosely because it's barely tabbed in to begin with. The hands are kind of grasping these 5mm tabs on the wings. You just want to undo those. You then take these back wing parts and rotate them up, which will unpeg them from these sides here. And you can also unhook these from there. They're hooked under there, and they just just rotate out to the sides. Separate the legs like so. Bring down the heel spurs, and yes, these aren't the original heel spurs. I'm fully aware that these are an upgrade kit, which I will explain the purpose of later. But what you want to do is rotate the tail fin back and bring the leg parts forward on this double hinge. They will then not really lock into place, but they are kind of sturdy, so it doesn't really matter. Rotate the waist around 180 degrees. Make sure the nose cone's all the way back if you haven't already. Separate these a bit and bring up the head. Then you've got double hinges in the torso that will lock the shoulders into place. I've heard some copies are pretty loose in that regard, but mine seems fine. Bring the elbows forward a little bit so that you can bring out the shoulder pads like so, and then you can position them however you like. Push the backpack together, and then this is a step that most people don't know about. You actually rotate these wings just a little bit up and they'll lock into place just at an angle like so. A lot of people don't realize this. I believe it's in the instructions, but many reviewers that I've seen have just neglected this step entirely. You can also rotate the wings back if you'd like. I like to do that because it gives her a nice backpack that looks nice and dynamic. These side bits fold into the wings like so, and I wish they locked in place. I wish there was a tab there. That's actually my biggest gripe with the transformation, aside from the locking tabs in the vehicle mode. Everything else is pretty good. Well, actually, that's my second. My actual biggest gripe is the null raise. You sort of stretch and unhook that, bring it out like so, and then turn it backwards and flip it the other way. It's easy to lock it into place when it's in its robot mode configuration, but it stretches the plastic when it's in its vehicle mode configuration. And I get it, this mode wasn't designed to have null raise here. The Takara designers did their best to make sure that they would fit, but I don't really see any point, especially considering you can't see the null raise in the vehicle mode. So you might as well leave them in their robot mode configuration. There's just no point. Plus, it's painted silver, and I don't know what the base plastic color is. It could be the turquoise, it could be the purple, or it could be the transparent aqua, or transparent, well, regular transparent. And that's a bit of a concern. If it's just regular old transparent, then that's brittle, and that's the last time I'm ever gonna do that again, just to be 100% safe. But either way, whether you're dealing with Slipstream or Windblade from this mold, I don't think it's that hateable. You have to realize that even when she came out as Slipstream in the Takara Legends line, this mold was still hated heavily, and I just don't think it's worth all of that hate. It's a first attempt, and it's a really good first attempt with some really interesting ideas. And engineering-wise, I still think it holds up today. They could do this exact transformation with just a few small locking tabs and it would pass as a modern figure. Well, provided they upgraded the heels like that, but every version since has had upgraded heels. So once again, fandom bias has blown things way out of proportion. And Elisa gets the job done, so kudos. In robot mode, Slipstream basically pushes the animated character model through an animeification filter, and it works surprisingly well, given it's a Windblade retool. Surprisingly, she manages to take on a whole new identity, despite only having a few new parts. The null rays speak for themselves, wrapping around the existing arm detail. I always like it when Seekers at least give you the option to mount the null rays on the forearms. Granted, there's basically no option to do anything otherwise here, but this is something I enjoy. And my word, the silver here is resplendent. Matter of fact, the conversion between modes allows a lot of silver to pop out, mainly on the thighs. You also get a smidge on the midriff, and it does a good job of breaking up the torso. Speaking of which, yes, it is a faux part, as tends to be the case with a lot of collector-grade Slipstreams, but at least it's painted and sculpted beautifully. The transparent aqua makes a return, but since it's surrounded by sculpted detail blocking out the light, it ends up looking closer to dark blue. This actually works really well given how it fits with the awesome metallic purple paints. The new chest actually does a really good job of lining up aesthetically with the existing shoulder pads. You'd be forgiven for thinking these were redone to fit the look better, but nope, matter of fact, she remains remarkably cohesive overall. Part of that's due to the paint, which, as I keep saying, is phenomenal. I mean, Christ, they've painted both sides of the wings. That's mental. You so rarely get that these days, and I understand given the brand unification and budgets and all that, but come on, mate, I have to praise this. She also remains pretty damn clean on the back, with naught but a nose cone clogging it up. Not a lot of hollowness either, which is remarkable for the time. Yeah, there's a tiny bit on the calves, but it's so minor. Overall, she's a pretty well-made fembot and carries a commanding shelf presence, even if part of that's due to her chest looking like a suit and tie, which is ironic given the Takara Legends canon, if you can even call it that. Once again, aesthetics-wise, she absolutely nails it. This is right up there with some of the best Takara decos on the aftermarket, and it's accentuated with wonderful sculpted detail. Once again, though, this gets hampered by solidity issues. Well, I say hampered, but it would be more accurate to say tripped up, because unlike the vehicle mode, the solidity issues here are a little more substantial. The chest has no locking mechanism at all. What the f***, mate? Like, it'll stay in place just fine, and I got it at release, so I can safely say it's held up for 1, 2, 3, minus postage time, 5 years. Was one of my first orders from Big Bad Toy Store, actually. Still, that doesn't change the fact that this mold needed more locking tabs. Something like this is much more egregious than the vehicle mode shortcomings, as a number of samples may have looseness there. I've also heard of the legs being loosey-goosey, but honestly, I've never had any issues personally. Just watch out for the QC front, I guess. What I have had issues with is the stability of the figure, though. If you've been around the fandom for a while, you'll probably know the primary issue of the Windblade mold. She cannot stand for the life of her. It's all due to these blasted things, the most worthless excuse for heels I've ever seen in my life. No, I'm not talking about high heels, I'm talking about regular-ass Transformers heels. One of the reasons I'm drawn to Transformers more so than other action figures is that I can just plonk them down on a table with no issue. It's something pretty much every Transformers figure, all the way back to Generation 1, is well known for. Now, for your average action figure fan, this is par for the course and no big deal. However, for your average Transformers fan, this is pretty much unacceptable. And yes, you can see here that I have installed a Shapeways upgrade kit, which hopefully I'll be able to leave a link to in the description. These are the ones I'd recommend using. I have tried ones by Ariel Lemon, the same guy who did these awesome Fall of Cybertron Legends figures, but the Shapeways plastic just doesn't lend itself to these sorts of designs. These end up working much better, even if they look like those height extenders they use in Marvel movies, and as expensive as they may be. Still nowhere near as bad as other add-ons you can get on the site. But enough getting off topic, that's not the point. The point is you shouldn't have to do this to a figure. I'll be honest, even with all of these flaws, I really like this figure, but when an upgrade kit is required to make a figure good, that figure has failed. Upgrade kits work best when they make an already good figure great, not when they fix the shortcomings of the mold. Fortunately, in the years since, with other Windblade molds, Hasbro has learned from their mistake. In some cases, they've taken it to the point of removing the element of transformation entirely, and giving the design to a Shmentai artist.
Did somebody say Shmentai?
No, we're not doing this. I'm not bogging down this video with unnecessary cameos, thank you very much.
Fine. Could I have your Star Saber, by the way?
No. There hasn't been a Windblade since that has had stability or structural issues. As for Slipstream herself, well, aside from some deeply compromised Cyberverse figures, she's not had a proper second chance in the spotlight. Well, aside from Iron Factory, but sadly not everyone is as into Legends as I am. This to me is disappointing, because I truly feel she deserves a second chance. Now with that said, even with the stability and solidity frustrations, I still think this is a damn fine release. Yes, she has issues, but I truly believe those issues can be looked past. I mean, hey, at least the stand port actually works in this mode. Speaking of, why don't retail action figures have stand ports? That shit should be standard. Their asses can barely stand it, you're not putting them in? For shame! Even then, here's the thing. Given the prices of the figure these days anyway, if you're gonna go out and hunt her down, the extra price tag of the upgrade kit isn't that much. And even then, if you don't get the upgrade kit, the way I see it, the kind of people who will be hunting this figure down years later will probably be huge fans of the character. You don't just waltz into a store and find her on a shelf at random, she requires online hunting. As such, if you're the kind of person who's willing to put in the extra time to hunt her down, you're probably the kind of person who will overlook such flaws because she's Slipstream. At the end of it all, these flaws are substantial, but not figure damning. It does make you wonder if the character connections ended up giving her the short end of the stick in the fandom. People can have crazy biases, and maybe in this instance mine are skewed in the positive direction, but honestly I don't think she's truly that bad. Anyway, articulation is surprisingly good for the time. Sure, there's no ankle tilt, but everything else is here. Word of warning though, do be careful with the head. They've stupidly cast the whole thing in clear plastic, which for me sounds like a recipe for disaster. They didn't even end up using the light piping since they painted over the eyes. Come on man, couldn't have used clear paint? Ah well. Also size-wise she may be slender, but the wingspan contributes quite a bit to her budget. In the end, Slipstream, and by extension Windblade, is a complex figure from an analytical perspective. There are layers and layers of fandom context that muddy the waters with her release. If you want my tinfoil hat hypothesis, I reckon the original mold was rushed due to the fan poll. I don't think she was given as much time to cook in the oven, especially when compared to other figures that came out at the time. And even if that wasn't the case, they're still dealing with a body type that they're not used to tackling. All things considered, I think they did as good as they could have, given the circumstances. These days, I believe the Hashtag designers could deliver a much better product, but for now, if you absolutely need a Slipstream on yourself, I don't think this is a bad choice. Her issues are substantial, but there's a very solid core here, and the colors alone are enough to justify a purchase. So yes, I ultimately do think the hatred for this mold is overblown, especially since these days I've seen what truly compromised engineering looks like. Over the years, I definitely have mellowed to her. There's a lot here that I didn't give her credit for at the time of her initial review, and I'm pretty glad I was able to rectify that all these years later. So if you like the look of this figure and can find her for a reasonable price, then give her a shot. If you don't like the aesthetic, well, then she's an easy skip. I know that may seem like a half-hearted recommend, but there is a lot to like here, provided you like the aesthetic. But it does beg the question, how much is too much? Ideally, given the actual quality of the figure, I wouldn't pay anything above $50 dues, but given the current state of the market, I don't think that's gonna happen. I mean, you can strike out in just the right circumstances. I got Masterpiece Wheeljack for $30, in the box mind you, but you can't really count on cases like that. Those are few and far between. So given the current state of the market and the flaws that this figure has, which are substantial, $70 Australian is the absolute highest I can recommend in good conscience. And even then, I hate recommending her at that price because I don't truly think she's worth it. But alas, that's just one of the sad truths of collecting. The secondhand market is never kind to those who missed out. If you do happen to see her for cheap, don't hesitate for a second, otherwise you'll be regretting it for the rest of your life. And if you do end up getting her, I still recommend getting the upgrade kit for the heels. Yes, it sucks that you have to get them in the first place, but if you're going to be spending that much on a figure to begin with, that kind of money is just chump change. I guess ultimately I'm just glad that I got myself back into collecting when she first came out, otherwise I would have been kicking myself to this very day. And hey, at least it's not the Fun Pub one. Yeah, the Fun Pub one looks like shit. There, I said it. What you gonna do?
Special thanks to Quartz Rules for the topic derailing cameo. Make sure to check out his Twitch channel, otherwise Vaughn will sneak into your house and steal whatever meat you have in the freezer. You have been warned.